Hello and welcome to the DocArena Podcast, in association with Film Ireland. My name is Ross Whitaker, and in this fortnightly podcast series, I talk to filmmakers about their documentaries, both in terms of the subjects they choose and the way in which they fund, craft, and distribute their work. In this episode, I'm delighted to speak to the brilliant documentarian Kim Bartley about her second feature, Pure Grit, a beautiful observational film set on a Native American reservation. The film is produced by Rachel Lysett for Underground Films and will have its world premiere next weekend. That's July 23rd, 2021 at the Galway Film Fleadh, both in person and online, and will no doubt play at many more international festivals to come. Chronicling 3 years in the life of a young Native American woman, Pure Grit is a thrilling and intimate tale of extreme bareback horse riding, young love, and the challenges of family life in a marginalised community. We also talk about Kim's first feature doc, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, released over 15 years ago, and the crazy experience of making a film that was massively revered but also attacked and undermined for political reasons. Here's a clip from Pure Grit.
Wow, Sharmaine all the way from Fort Washington, Wyoming.
Not everybody is made to bareback race. It takes a lot of heart, a lot of guts.
When you're on top, there's always somebody down here coming for you.
I'm unbeatable.
Everybody gets beat.
We actually met on Facebook.
Thank God she looks just like her pictures. We went through a lot of abuse, and if it continued, who knows if any of us would even be alive.
Do you plead guilty or not guilty?
Guilty. I've been away from home and I've came back and raced before.
Did any girls come up to you?
No.
We love each other, we do, but we just can't stand each other.
My horse racing is the love of my life. That's all I'm gonna keep thinking about.
You have to stick through the fire and the rain, you know.
I guess it runs through our blood. That's the way it is. I was born to do this. Ready now? Yeah. No.
Kim, thanks a million for joining me. And I suppose to start off with, in your own words, could you kind of explain what the film is about?
Well, it's a very kind of old school observational documentary, and it centres around a Native American young woman who is a bareback horse racing champion, or at least was. When I came into her life, she had stopped racing, but she was just a fascinating character. She'd stopped racing, which was the reason I got in touch with her, was the racing, but she also was in this new relationship, and the minute I met her and her girlfriend, their kind of love story became part of the story that I wanted to tell. So that's what it's about, really. She decided she wanted to start racing again, and I followed her through that. And then, like I said, it also became about the relationship and various other things that went on. But that's kind of the story.
Yeah, and there's a huge amount of kind of story textures there and also visual textures. But how did you end up a woman from Ireland in this environment? What led you there into this quite incredible place, I suppose? Well,
it was pure chance, and our docs so often are, aren't they? And I was actually filming in the States on another project. I was on a reservation, a different one. I came across the bareback racing, and I'd never seen it at that level, and it was just, it was a dream to shoot because it was just extraordinary looking and colourful and exciting and scary and all of that. And I just thought that was fascinating. And then I happened to talk to a girl who was racing. She was the only woman there that day. And I was just interested. And she kind of said, it's growing. There's always one race that women take part in, but the rest of it is all men. And I left and came home, and it was stuck in my head. And I just started looking up it online. And really, the only connection I could make to any of the women who raced was through Facebook. So I kind of friended one, and she, through her, I came across others. And I'm not a Facebook person. I really don't use it at all. But along the way, up popped Sharmaine, who's the star of this documentary, I suppose. And I suppose she has a very striking look. she was very interesting looking to begin with. And then I just started chatting to her on Facebook, and she was just very open, very, she's a gay woman as well, living with her girlfriend, which I probably mistakenly at the time thought was kind of unusual. As it turned out, it wasn't that big a deal really, where she lives, but that was it. So it was, we had this kind of Facebook friendship. I had one or two chats with her on the phone. I had no idea of her background, the kind of her past, which reveals itself in the documentary. And the next shoot I went on to the States, very luckily, a flight fell through and I ended up stranded somewhere for 4 days. And I thought, okay, I'm going to hop on a plane to Wyoming. Gave her a bell and just said, like, I'll be there tomorrow if that's okay. And landed at her place and shot for 4 days, which I never intended to. I had the camera because I was off on another shoot. And I pretty much every frame that I shot over those 4 days is in the doc. She was just so incredibly open straight away. The family were so welcoming. We just got on. And that was it, really. So it really was weird. Now, then it's so remote and so far away that when I came home and went, okay, this is a doc, then the rest of it was another headache. How you even get back there was so expensive to get there. It was so far. And as you know yourself, really hard to finance a documentary that's observational in nature, because everyone wants to know what's going to happen next and where does it end and how long do you need. And I had no idea because I'd literally spent 4 days, but instinctively I just knew that there was something in her, from those 4 days. So.
And in a way, by doing those 4 days, I suppose you had done a part of the development part of the project. You could probably make a trailer out of that and so on. So that was fortuitous.
It was, exactly. And that's what I did. I cut a trailer out of those 4 days, and within those 4 days, in fact, on the second day, kind of out of nowhere, Sharmaine started telling me about her past, and she's a survivor of sexual abuse as a young woman. She went to court on her own. I mean, she was kind of rejected by her family when she spoke out about this. She went to court as a 14-year-old and stood up and gave evidence against this person. So she was just incredible. And this is all in the space of 4 days. So suddenly I kind of had gone to meet her to make this female racing doc in a way. That's what was in my mind. And then it turned into everything else. And I suppose that then I started becoming more aware. I would have read about, violence against women, particularly Indigenous women. There's a high incidence of sexual violence and violence against women in Native American and Alaskan communities and Canadian First Nation, that kind of thing. But I started learning a bit more about that through her. And then I thought, okay, well, actually, there's more than just a racing story here. There's all these other layers. So yeah, it was a very fortuitous trip. Yeah.
And isn't it funny that despite the fact that with these observational films, it has always been the case and pretty much will always be the case that you can't tell people what's going to happen. And yet so many of them turn out to be among the best films you'll ever see, that they're still hard to get funded. It's a strange...
I know. I was listening to a podcast just the other day with Steve James about more recent projects, but he just mentioned Hoop Dreams, which would have been a defining doc for me years ago. And I think he said that he got a grant of $2,000, and for the first couple of years that was all he had. And you just kind of go, that is one of the defining ob docs of its time. I'm sure you and anyone our generation was influenced by it. And I mean, not much has changed really. This is it. And I think there's a real push in recent times. Like, I think documentaries having a real moment, but I think within that there's been a real push to make documentaries fit into this kind of narrative dramatic structure that isn't always right for a documentary. And it's something I'm struggling with more. Like, I just, I like, production values have gone through the roof and all that is great, but it leaves things like observational documentaries behind because it doesn't have a 3-act structure necessarily. You can't tell them what's going to happen. You can't necessarily have very high production values because that's not the nature of the doc. So yeah, no, they're difficult ones to fund.
Yeah, it does feel like documentary is having a golden moment, but at the same time, the docs almost have to be golden tickets in a way, you know. God, that's a terrible way of saying it. But, you know, if it's about an incredibly famous person, then yes, everybody wants to make it. But traditionally, I think probably a lot of people came into documentaries wanting to tell the stories of ordinary people. And it feels like they're almost harder to tell than ever. But you mentioned Hoop Dreams being one of the defining documentaries for you. What were the other ones that led you to get into documentary making? Because I suppose around the time of your earlier films was probably when that was starting to kick off, and there weren't that many films that had broken through into the kind of general consciousness at that point to have inspired you. But what were they?
You know, it's really funny. It's something I'd need to have a think about, because Hoop Dreams is the one that sticks out, and other subsequent Steve James docs as well. But I grew up in France, and there's a French documentary maker called Depardon who always did very much kind of the low key obdoc stuff that I love. Or things like, he was the first to put a camera in the courts, so he would just have a locked off camera in the back of the courts. I've tried to show them to people here. They don't seem to exist with subtitles. I don't know, but he would have been a huge influence. Now he was a lot older than me, and his heyday would probably have been the 80s, and he's done a few since. But other than that, I'm not even sure that I used to watch that many docs. I suppose when I started out, it was very much, it was more in kind of a type of journalism, if you like when I was doing the stuff I used to do in, you know, emergency response or covering aid work and hurricanes or that kind of thing. So it was less about documentary film and more about documenting, I suppose. But then, you know, like I still gravitate towards that kind of observation. Like, there's so many amazing high-end docs now that aren't observations. If you take, or when I say high-end, I mean high production values and very, you know, structured. So if you think of The Act of Killing, or if you think of Casting John Benet, or those kind of docs, they're fascinating. Still, I'm drawn though to like Minding the Gap. I loved last year, whenever that was, a couple of years ago. I don't know if you saw in the Dublin Film Festival recently, the Romanian Akasa.
Yes, I did.
I
yeah,
really
it was amazing.
thought that was incredible. But there aren't that many of those types of docs around, really. They tend to be more the Icaruses, or the, you know, the, like you said, or something structured around someone well known or celebrity or whatever it is.
Very kind of conceptual films that you can either they're sold by the form, or you can immediately put a character at the center of it that just seems obvious. You know, it's true. But you're right. I mean, that Romanian film was amazing. Also Collective, which is also completely observational Romanian film. Like, that's another one from the last 18 months that, when it's done well, it's the best form of documentary filmmaking. But going back to the journalistic side, I mean, like, I would have first seen your work, you know, with The Revolution Will Not Be Televised. I was actually in Toronto at Hot Docs, and I was watching the films that hadn't been selected. I was writing for a magazine, and you could watch some of the films that hadn't been selected. And I said, I will watch the Irish films. And I saw your film. And I remember emailing David Power, who was one of the producers at the time, and just being like, this film has blown me away. It's the best thing I've seen this week. And it wasn't shown. Now, I know what I watched was actually a rough cut at the time, so maybe it was just a timing thing. But what led you to that film? Was it that kind of more journalistic type of thing that you were doing? Who were you doing those things for? You know, what was that path?
Well, that was at the time I was working doing the emergency thing with Concern. So basically, anytime Concern went out to cover an emergency, I went with them and filmed or photographed their work. And there had been these awful mudslides in Venezuela in 2001, or was it late 2000? Oh. Anyway, it's a long time ago now. And I was out there with them, and I was aware of Chavez. I'd read about him, and I thought he sounded interesting, but I didn't know anything about him. And I would have spent a lot of time. I'd lived in Colombia, I'd lived in South America, but I'd never been to Venezuela. So I ended up there, and just thought there was something really interesting going on the ground. He had just got in, and I was very much in the hills out in the Barrios, you know, which was always, you know, his stronghold. So I became became really interested in him, and I just thought, and oh, you know, it's funny, I haven't talked about this in so long, but I met some military guy on the side of a hill who was, you know, working with the military to dig people out or whatever was going on at the time, and he said it was pure magic realism. You know, he was like, "Oh, my cousin's uncle works for Chavez or whatever. You know, I could get you a contact there." And I was kind of like, "Yeah, great." And I followed that up and followed. It actually led to some kind of a contact about a year later, but it was a bit pie in the sky. But anyway, so I went home thinking, this person is fascinating. The reaction to him on the ground is fascinating. I have this little in that I thought I had, and Donncha O'Brien, who ended up directing it with, was very interested, probably more from a political point of view. Like I hadn't been that familiar with Chavez's politics. Donncha was, and was very interested, and that was it. Then we just thought, okay, well, this is a doc we have to do because we have this in that actually we didn't really have at all. Thought we had. So that's where that came from. And I mean, look, thanks for saying how much you liked it, and it's still, you know, it was one of those, it was just once in a lifetime thing. You know, it was just an extraordinary story, an extraordinary time to be there. We killed ourselves getting there and getting in. So I can't say it was luck, but there was an element of luck, obviously, that we were there on the day when the coup happened and everything else. So it was. I mean, it was a life-defining documentary for me, and also one as a documentary maker, because it was my first feature that I think you look back now and you think the aftermath I would have dealt with so differently. You know, like you kind of need to have another idea in your back pocket when you're out there doing the circuit, because you get so consumed with promoting the film and you have this tiny little window of opportunity. And instead I look back now and I had all these, met these incredible people, and, you know, probably could have got the finance together to make another doc, but I was just like blown away and completely destroyed physically and mentally from making the documentary, and that's it. So this is like, this Pure Grit is the next feature doc. I kind of couldn't even face into that.
It was an incredible film. I mean, it's just, and it's funny, you know, I saw there was like a small, I hate mentioning social media, but there was a small discussion about it on Twitter or something the other day, and Tim Wardle, who made Three Identical Strangers, mentioned it as one of the defining documentaries of his development, I suppose. And like, he's a really documentary maker I think is really brilliant and is only going to do lots more amazing things. And it's incredible to think of the scope of it, you know, and how many people must have seen it along the way. And it is that thing for every first time filmmaker, you know, who has any type of success, let alone, I think, you know, that film was at one stage won an award for being the best documentary in the world that year at Banff, which I remember it all really well, funnily enough, because I was following the story so closely. But, you know, it's almost impossible at that stage of your career, when you've put everything into your first film, to have a second film. I mean, you don't think that way. You just think, I would just want to make a film and get it finished. And wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? Wouldn't it be wonderful to show in one festival, let alone, you know, for it to go on a circuit and so on. So it's a lot to ask of a first-time filmmaker. But I mean, can you talk a little bit more about that time, I suppose, and having that? I suppose you may not have realized at that moment that you kind of had lightning in a bottle, but you still had to, as you say, you know, there's an element of luck. Well, there really isn't. Like, luck is showing up, I think, sometimes, you know, especially for observational filmmaking. Nothing will happen if you're not there to film it in terms of making a film. But you still had to edit it. You still had to, you know, somebody had to take it to the world. That must have been a really interesting process to go through the first time.
It was. I mean, it really was. Like the making of, I think we were in Venezuela for 9 months. So like, it was a massive undertaking. Like, you know, people were screaming at us to come home, and all we had at that point was this portrait and the access that we knew was was quite incredible, but nothing was happening as such dramatically, and yet we knew you just knew there was something in the air. You knew something was going to happen. Now, obviously, I had no idea that it would be a coup, but I just knew both myself and Danica felt that we need to stay on longer. This isn't over. So there was that push pull constantly. Like, there's no more money. Get on a plane home. I sold my car over the phone. We just did everything we could to stay on. And then obviously that happened. So and then I suppose what the experience was overwhelming in itself, because I suppose the immediate aftermath of the coup was kind of scary. There was all this stuff of, you better hide the footage and all that thing. That was something that we never had planned on dealing with, obviously. And then when we went into the edit, well, I mean, look, with a documentary, you're kind of reinventing your story every day, every time you take the camera out, and then you go to the edit and you're reinventing it again. So it went from being this portrait, and so much of the footage we shot was with a view to that. So just talking to people in the street or what have you. Then suddenly the coup was, we captured this on camera, and that meant a whole restructure, because then you kind of needed more of a sense of the hinterland and the past and what led to that. And so and we hadn't been shooting it that way. We'd been shooting it very much as an obdoc, following Chavez's nurse around for a day to see what she would do, so it was a very tricky edit. We had an amazing editor, Angel Zoido, who was Spanish, because we knew we needed a Spanish. I speak Spanish, and Danica spoke reasonably good Spanish at that point, but for the edit you needed someone who spoke Spanish. But I suppose the edit was really difficult. Not so much, I mean, structurally it was difficult, but then this whole other thing was going on where Venezuela was so polarized at the time that there was an absolute movement against the film from certain quarters, and very political, money being thrown at trying to discredit it and that kind of thing. And that was very difficult. And I mean, we were first-time filmmakers. They were, luckily, I don't even think, was social media around at the time? Very little anyway. But so it would have been more in newspapers and what have you. But there, the some of the stuff that was thrown at us was quite traumatic and hard to deal with. And yeah, I mean, Danica left kind of going, I never want to work in this business again. I think I suffered PTSD for years after, because it was such an attack on us. But but it was an incredible experience. But that's it. It was such a whirlwind. A lot of the time I can't even remember, because I didn't talk about it for years. It was just too much to handle, really, to go back over, And with age, it's funny, you go back and you kind of think, like a lot of the times people would have said, would you go back? Would you revisit it? When Chavez was ailing or after he died and that kind of thing. And it was always like, no, I could not go back there. I'm not saying I would now, but I don't have that kind of visceral kind of, no, I need to do something else. That's past now, thankfully. Yeah.
I think when you throw yourself so wholly into something, there's a recovery time. It's almost like a relationship. Like they say, for every year you're in a relationship with someone, it takes 6 months to recover or something like that. So like, I think if you've thrown yourself so wholly into an obdoc scenario and then add everything else that came with that film, and I've sort of forgotten about all that aftermath of the negativity that was thrown towards it. I was such a fan of it that I just saw that as kind of, noise trying to derail something that was so clearly good. But so let's kind of draw a line under that, because I didn't mean to talk about that actually very much. But
I'm not traumatized today. It's okay.
No, I know, but just we should really be talking about pure grit, and it's kind of interesting with the gap between them, like to think of how much you've evolved as a documentary maker, more so in a television form, I suppose, but using all the same skills. To come to this film, knowing, I suppose, that this was your second feature a number of years on. What was your mentality going into it in terms of how you wanted to make it? And it is a little bit different to making a television documentary in that, in a way, a feature film, for want of a better word, you're making a statement. You know, you have an approach. You knew that you were making this feature. It was in a very specific kind of environment. What was your thought process going into it in terms of what you wanted to create?
I'm not sure that I approach TV docs or that I approach this feature doc in a different way, in a way, because I suppose with every doc that I make, I want people to feel like they've had a little window into a world that they wouldn't otherwise have, and to come away feeling different about it, and maybe thinking about it or questioning it. And that's exactly what I wanted with this. I think that, like, I would have done a good bit of work with travelers here or in traveling communities, and I suppose there are huge parallels. And it was very much, like I said, I didn't really know a whole lot about Native American communities, but the minute I got there, it was like, wow, this, I know this in so many ways. And the levels of racism in the States towards Native Americans, and that's kind of not talked as much about it as it would be with African Americans, for example, or Asian communities. And I just, so I suppose for me it was all I want from this is to give people a window into this little world that, or not little world, but this world it's not, even within the States, most people don't really have that much of an idea of what goes on a reservation. And I suppose Native Americans, it's a bit like the prejudices people have against travelers here. Native Americans, largely due to Hollywood, people, it's either, they're redskins on horses or whatever notions people have, or maybe if you live alongside them in a city, for a lot of people, it's like the same attitude as they have to travelers here. So it's like, they're uneducated, they're this, they're that. And then you step into the world and there are a lot of social problems. There's a lot of, historical trauma. But then there's also this incredible, obviously the one, Wind River, the reservation I was on, is just extraordinary looking. It's a stunning part of the world. It's so remote. It's very, very harsh to live there because the winters are really long and very, very tough. Summers are very, very hot, but my God, it's just beautiful, And then a lot of people that I met live in harmony with nature and really try to hang on to those ways and that culture they have that's been passed down. So it's, every second or more, 9 out of 10 kids you meet on the res will be, in hip hop gear, and they're listening to rap. But then they'll also go and do a sweat at the weekend, or they will, hope to be the pipe holder when they're 18, or, so it's a really, really interesting world that way, and a mix of cultures that's really, really fascinating. So I suppose that was it. I mean, I didn't really have any kind of a plan because it all happened so randomly. But then once I got in there, and plus I think we were very lucky, because I think there is a sense on the reservation very much of wariness towards outsiders coming in. And I remember that first 4 days I was there, Sharmaine's brother, who's in the first few minutes of the film, the guy who trains her, was kind of saying, like, a few people have approached us at races before and wanted to film something, but we were like, no, there's no, no. And we just hit it off. So we were very lucky that way. And then there's this whole discourse at the moment around, representation, and should a white woman from Ireland be telling the story of a Native American woman from Wyoming? Now, I have massive issues around all that. I think representation is really important. I think it's really important that diverse voices are out there and given the tools to tell their stories. But I suppose the fact is, at the moment, not everyone has the tools to tell their stories. And I hope it becomes that way. But I mean, even here, filmmaking is a privilege, and hard enough if you're from a middle-class background and have the education and whatever it is else to survive on a job that doesn't actually make a whole lot of money. But if you're outside of that, it's very, very difficult. So I think that once if someone actually wants you to tell their story, which was very much the case in Sharmaine's case, then then it's a privilege to tell it. And I don't think you need to worry too much about gender or colour or race. That's my feeling anyway. Once there's a respect there, who cares what colour you are, really?
Yeah, that is a whole other conversation for sure. Yeah, and even in the last few sentences there's probably several things we could talk about for quite a long time, but maybe not today. Coming back to pure grit though, and I just think that if you're telling this story primarily for, I'm going back to the television versus film thing, and if you're telling the story primarily for a television audience, I feel like you might ask, or you might choose to in the edit to bring parts of the story to the fore, or parts of interviews to the fore that might more hit issues on the head, if you know what I mean. You might say, okay, racism isn't like because often I suppose with television docs you say like, these are the issues that we need to address, whereas in this case you're unfolding some of those issues very subtly within an observational framework. So to my mind, your approach to this does probably differ a little bit, whether or not you realize it at the time, you know what I mean, or whether or not that's something that comes through in the edit and trying to piece it together on a more filmic narrative way. Do you think that's fair to say?
Probably. I hadn't thought about that at all. I mean, I suppose it would be like, I mean, you could make 10 different docs with the same footage in the edit, obviously. And I think one of the frustrations I have with TV is this constant need for voiceover, which I've no issue with voiceover. In some situations it's needed and I love it. But I think there is a I suppose from it, I don't know, maybe the biggest difference in my mind between delivering something for TV or, like you said, a feature doc, is that I think television underestimates their audience an awful lot of the time. And there's this sense always that you have to dumb things down or explain stuff. Whereas when you're doing a feature, it's acceptable to make the audience work hard and have to hang on to everything, every detail to so that it all unfolds and makes sense in the end. But I think that's a failure of TV. I think people are very capable of watching things and enjoying them without being spoon-fed and reminded at the top of the part after the ad what happened 2.5 minutes ago. So I suppose obviously in the edit you'd approach it differently, but I don't think in terms of filming or what I'm trying to say, I never thought of them as two distinct things, I have to say.
There's a number of things about this film that I loved. I mean, obviously Sharmaine at the center of it is just this unbelievable character, and you could watch her for hours if she said nothing. Like she's just so alluring, and you just feel that there's so much within her just by looking at her. She has incredible presence, I think, which I'm sure you're happy to hear, because I know as a filmmaker often you feel that way about your characters, and you often wonder, will other people feel the same way as well? But she certainly does. But the thing that struck me the most and kind of blew me away actually was just the quality of your filming. I just think it is one of the most beautifully shot by a director things I've ever seen. And
wow.
I wondered, I suppose, about that path as a director that also films. And I sometimes say it and it feels kind of slightly embarrassing to say, but like when you're a shooting director and you have the camera in your hand, there's no moment where you have to communicate to somebody else what it is you want. You are in the moment and you're responding to what's in front of you. And for want of a better phrase, or one that sounds less awful, it's the camera at that point is the paintbrush in your hand, and I would love to hear how you have, and I'm sure it's just happened gradually, but how you've developed that process over the years, and how you kind of think about what you're filming as you're doing it.
Well, look, it's exactly as you said it. I mean, I ended up doing it out of frustration at not being able to necessarily communicate properly what I wanted. And I've worked with amazing camera people over the years, but for that kind of intimate filming, you know, the way you just notice something tiny, and you might be in mid conversation as you notice it, and if you had to mid conversation turn to a cameraman and go, get a shot of the fly on her knee, it ruins it, you know what I mean? So, and I mean, I have worked with camera people who who pick up on those things, but it's a very, it's a very subtle thing. And I just started thinking I might as well just try and do it myself. And like, I had done a lot of filming, like I said, when I was on the road with Concern and all of that, uh, fully automatic a lot of the time. And I look back now and go, oh my God. And I've no formal training. So, I mean, I do it because I love it, but I actually couldn't even tell you what I'm doing. I'm not even sure I could, I have lenses and I know what they do, but I couldn't even tell you what lenses they are. Like, I'm completely untechnical. It's purely instinctive. And I would never, I mean, I'm completely blown away by what you've said there, because I wouldn't think of myself as anything when it comes to camera. If someone else said shoot my doc for me, there's no way I'd do it, because I wouldn't feel technically up to it. But it works for the kind of work I do, and obviously I have improved, as the more you shoot, the better you get at it. And the other thing is, like, really, somewhere like Wyoming, with the light that exists there, it's like shooting in somewhere like Arizona. It shoots itself. It's so easy to get beautiful images because the light, whereas in Ireland on a flat day, it's so hard to get something that looks really beautiful when the light is grey and flat. It's a much easier thing to do when you have stunning light. And I like, this is kind of going off, but it's also part of it, is that I work with my partner who does the sound, and that's a little bit that kind of thing I was saying that you try to get with a camera person, is it's a kind of an unspoken instinctive sense of what's important or what's not. And that's really useful for me, because I used to do everything. I used to do sound as well, and it's too much. It's just too much, and I would never do it again given the chance, because there's just too much going on, and you can't focus on what you're trying to film. Whereas when you've someone there who has become part of the scenery as you have, and has developed the same kind of friendships or relationships that you have with the people, then I can keep a conversation going with someone and turn my camera to the left to pick up something that I want, because I'm just aware of it in my peripheral vision. And Colm can keep the mic on that person because he knows what they're saying is really important, and he won't suddenly throw the boom across because I've moved the camera. So those things are really, I mean, doing it on your own or doing it with a sidekick who's on the same wavelength is just massive. So important for this kind of documentary making. Like, I wouldn't presume ever to sit down beautifully lit interviews. I wouldn't be able to. But this kind of verite style, I love doing it on my own.
Yeah, and I sometimes think it's something that directors can be discouraged from doing, because it's almost a sense of like, oh, we need to get you a DOP to make this thing as nice as it can be, but you'll never capture the same moments that you will on your own.
Yeah.
In that scenario with a bigger crew. When you're on the shoots, then, are you thinking of the scene as you're doing it? Are you thinking of the edit, or are you thinking of a certain type of shot variety? Are you thinking about a kind of a thematic kind of thing? I mean, I know some of these things can be instinctive and they just become part of the signature of what you do, but how are you approaching it in the moment? I suppose I'm sure you probably don't sit down the night before shoots anymore and do shot lists and stuff like that. It's more the experience has led you to a place where you go with the flow of it and you have the confidence. But in saying that, then you have to be able to respond to what you see in front of you.
Well, it's largely instinctive, but then I suppose what I would always do, the one thing I learned from the Chavez documentary all those years ago was not to overshoot. I'm very, very controlled in what I shoot, because, I think that confidence builds when you're starting out. You're just terrified you'll miss something, and you shoot everything. And I never do that anymore. But I suppose what I do is I just go instinctively with whatever's happening, and then I would always, that night or whenever I have a minute to myself, make a little note of what I shot and what ideas it sparked, or what else I need to follow up on that. And then, I mean, look, the thing was with this documentary, it was so far away that I think we were there 6 times. And like the first time was 4 days, another time was for a week. I think the longest we ever were there for was 2.5 weeks. So that's quite unusual, because if I was shooting something here, you have you can just pop out and do a couple of hours here and there. But I am definitely, like, I'm always editing in my head, always as I shoot. I'm so when you say shot selection, I quite love close-ups. So I would shoot close up quite a lot, but I'm also, yeah, I'm just constantly editing. So if I am with someone in the moment and then they hop in a car and they're gone, I know that scene won't hold together necessarily unless I have a couple of other shots, and I'll just get them there and then. I never leave stuff for later, especially here, because the scenery was so completely different from one trip to the next that you'd never be able to do a pickup, because it would just, be totally different. But yeah, I suppose, look, I'm very instinctive in everything I do, so I don't really think things through a whole lot in a very structured way, I think, until having said that, sorry, I'm contradicting myself now. Having said that, I'm always editing in my head. So I suppose I just kind of shoot what I know I'll need, and then the rest happens in the prep for the edit, really. And look, the other thing is, because I don't want to forget to say this because it's so fundamental, is that your editor is your co-author, So Paul Mullen, who edited this, brought so much to it himself, that I think for any documentary you make, the director gets all the limelight, and really they shouldn't.
It's such a key relationship within documentary making, isn't it, with the editor, and which can make it hard, because it's where all the stakes are of the story, I suppose, is when you're in that edit and you're really trying to make the most of your material, and you want to get the best out of that person because they can bring their own magic and their own storytelling and everything to it, and then you're trying to also insert what you know from the shoot back into it because it's completely fresh to them. How do you approach the edit? I mean, different people do it differently. Sometimes people will give all the material to an editor and leave them alone for a period of time. Other people will come in with, here's a sense of the story that I want to tell roughly, and so on. How do you do it?
I spend a lot of time. Well, first thing I do is I go through every single bit of sync that I have, or interviews, and I transcribe everything. And I already have an idea in my head, like I said, as I'm shooting. It keeps evolving, but certainly by the time I come to the prep, I have a very good idea of the structure that I want or that I have in mind, which obviously will change again in the edit. But so that's what I do. I don't, because I've shot it all myself, I kind of know everything that's there. You forget bits, but what you don't remember is the dialogue, or you don't remember necessarily what people said to you in interviews. So that's what I go through kind of forensically and transcribe everything, and then try and fit that into the structure that I had in mind. And then I would go to Paul. Meanwhile, Paul would be going through all the footage himself, as far as possible. But like I said, I don't overshoot, so usually it's quite manageable. And then I think it's really important to give an editor space and time, but I'm not someone who just kind of throws the rushes and walks away. I couldn't do that. I'm kind of quite hands-on in lots of ways as well. So with Paul, we have a system where I might do 2 days on, 2 days off, that kind of thing. Now, we got caught by COVID on this because the last trip was the last flight out of the States before they shut down. And between the jigs and the reels, we had we had gone into the edit before that because the final trip was unexpected. It was due to the death of the person who dies in the documentary. I mean, anyway, whatever. I won't say it for anyone who hasn't seen it, but so we went back. So we had already had a good bit in the edit together, but then it was remote and I'd never done it. Now I can do it in my sleep now, but it was a very steep learning curve, I think, for both of us to try and get this feature doc that we'd done maybe 3 weeks on and do the rest of it remotely, But because we've worked together so often, I think it settled quite quickly. But I think Paul probably, I'd say he probably had more input than he would normally have because of that. Because even though I'm there remotely or discussing stuff and whatever, I'm still not sitting over his shoulder like I would normally. So, and that was great because he, like I said, he just has a great sense of pace and would be on the same wavelength as me musically, and I think music was really, really important to this doc. So it worked out really well. But as you said, it's such a fundamental relationship. If it's not right, I don't know how. I couldn't walk into a room and start it and make the same doc again with an editor that I'd never met before, or that I met but just didn't click with.
Yeah, it's just so important, isn't it? And there's a couple of things there to talk about. One is the music is phenomenal. I think Stephen Shannon was one of the composers. It's
Stephen Shannon and Kevin Murphy.
Yeah.
They did it. Oh, I mean, they did an amazing job. I just love it. They're hoping they can release it as a well, not necessarily the soundtrack because we won't have the rights to the other stuff. But yeah, beautiful job.
Yeah, no, it's phenomenal.
And that was something that people asked me a lot at the beginning was, are you going to integrate Native American music? Or are you going to use Native American music? And I really didn't want to, because I thought then it just turns into kind of a National Geographic type doc. I really didn't want that. I wanted it to feel quite cinematic and non-native in terms of the sound. And that's why they came in. So, Lancome are in there, which I think people would associate with very much Irish music, but I think it really fits. I really think it works well.
No, the music is brilliant throughout, and it was one of those things where sometimes if you notice the music too much, it's a problem. But about halfway through, I just said, wow, it just struck me. This soundtrack is great. Like, it's really well done. And then again, I was waiting for the credits to see who had done it, and I actually would know Stephen. So like it's really well done. So that but with that process, again, it's something people approach differently, and certainly I like the idea of waiting as late as possible for the music, whereas I think some editors really love to cut with the music. So it's a case of like, please start getting some stuff in early so that we can start feeling the textures. How did you approach it in this case?
I always do the same way, and it's down to budget and everything else. Like, I usually use guide tracks that just give a sense of the pace and tone that I want, and then when we get to a fairly good rough cut stage, we send it out. And I'd love for the sake of the composers to be able to have someone in from the get-go, because I think for a composer it must be kind of frustrating to have guide tracks when they'd love to just to be honest, they actually went off completely away from the guide tracks that were there in a lot of pretty much for the whole thing. They had a very good sense of what they wanted to do. But no, I think that maybe if you had the luxury of weeks and weeks in the edit and what have you, you could go at the composed music earlier. But I've never been in that situation. So I use guide tracks, and then once you're at a reasonable rough cut stage, I'm trying to think when we did it in this case, and I can't remember, but maybe first viewing kind of time. Then we'd send it over to Stephen and Kevin, and then leave them at it,
Yeah, coming back to what you're saying about not shooting too much, that's a godsend for an editor in a way. I think people imagine that editors want more and more stuff to work with, but I remember hearing someone tell me a few years ago that they'd shot 500 hours towards a documentary, and they were delighted because they're like, we're going to have so much great material. And I just thought, this film will never see the light of day because it's going to take you about 20 weeks just to watch that. And then you're going to have to start editing, and who can do that? So how do you figure out, I suppose, or how do you, on the day when you're filming, know what you do and don't want? Because it takes us a lot of confidence to be able to not film. And do you have any thoughts on that? Because I think that's something that could be very helpful to people who are shooting observationally, to know that you don't have to shoot 6 hours a day.
It's a difficult one to answer. I mean, I think a lot of it is in how well you get to know your subjects and your characters, because you kind of, same thing as you would with people in everyday life, you have a good sense of how they're going to react to something, or what's happening in their lives today. Now, obviously, you can't tell. They suddenly get a phone call or whatever, and that's the killer if you weren't rolling. I think that, look, the main thing is to actually forgive yourself if you miss something, because for a long time I would literally lie awake at night beating myself up because I had decided not to, not to have, well, I always have the camera with me, but I wasn't rolling, let's say. And I mean that, and you just can't do that. So I just kind of, now if I miss something, I've missed it and that's it. But in terms of trying to decide, it's again, it's kind of instinctive, but I suppose you probably shoot more at the beginning when you don't know people that well, and then the more you get to know them, the more you can kind of preempt possibly how they're going to react. Now, the funny thing is too that, and I don't like generalizing, so I'm not going to say Native Americans, but the Native Americans that I have met, for the most part, tend to be very kind of underwhelmed in their reactions to things, including Sharmaine. So, in the early days, I might have thought like, oh, I don't know, I can't even think of an example, but let's say, I know she's getting some good news today, so I'll roll on that, expecting anyone, including myself, to be kind of going like, whoa, that's fucking brilliant, whatever. And Sharmaine would go, yeah, that's good. And you're like, ah, that's just not what I was expecting. But once I got used to that, and you're not expecting any kind of overwhelming, very visible reaction. And again, there you get to know someone. Like, so Sharmaine, for instance, is someone who thinks stuff through a lot. So when something happens, good or bad, she doesn't react a whole lot. And then she goes off, and maybe a day later, maybe a week later, she'll suddenly want to talk about it, and she'll have processed it and kind of have given it a lot of thought. But again, that's something you learn as you get to know someone, But the thing of overshooting is I think it's experience, isn't it? Because you know yourself, you're never going to go through half the rushes if you have 500 hours, really.
Yeah, you're only causing yourself problems, and I think sort of 20 beautifully shot, well considered hours are definitely going to trump 500. And some of the best observational filmmakers, when I read about them, you learn that they shoot for far less time than you'd expect. They might shoot entire doc over the course of a month, where other people are following characters for years and years and years and years for one documentary. And of course that can have great value as well. But speaking about, instinctively reacting to the story that you ended up with and the one that you started off making, I imagine are two different things in this case. Am I right in saying that? And how did you kind of evolve your notion of what you were making?
Okay, well, like I said before, I started off thinking it was going to be just about a female racer. Then her relationship with her girlfriend really came to the fore, because her girlfriend was a lovely counterbalance personality-wise to Sharmaine. Sharmaine, like I said, can be quite low-key, or she's not outwardly very joyous necessarily as a person. She's quite calm. And her girlfriend, Savannah, is the opposite. She's just a bubbly, giggly, she's a darling. I'm mad about her. She's a lovely, lovely kid, but they're very, very different. And I kind of had a sense at the beginning that was the story that I was telling. I was telling the story of their relationship. That's kind of what it became at one point. Then their relationship evolved, and Sharmaine started getting back into the racing, because the racing thing was all planned and then kept falling through. So like for the first few months she was going to race, and then it just didn't happen, and you're kind of like, where's my story? And then she started racing. So it was constantly, and in the edit it was the same thing. It was kind of, is this the story of the racing, or is it the story of relationship, or is it both? And I think in a way it's both. But I suppose character-wise, it very much is Sharmaine's story, because at one point I thought it might be both their stories, but it really is Sharmaine's story. And then it also, that whole, like I said, that whole hinterland, and that whole, Sharmaine's sister's story is very important. Everything that happened within the family, I never intended to really tell her family story, because they weren't reticent is the wrong word, but they're very private. So while they were always happy to be on camera kind of in the background, they weren't dying to, tell me their stories themselves. But again, as time went on, people suddenly would kind of go, well, actually, I'd like you to film me, And then a lot happened within the family. So that became another another strand. So in a way, what it ended up being, I think, is, the love story and the racing are part of it, but what it is a kind of a portrait of one woman and the kind of the women around her. So her mom, her sister, her girlfriend, the little niece, and
Her sister-in-law.
her sister-in-law Mary, another. They were just such lovely people too. I mean, we were very, very lucky because we kind of liked them all, which makes things easier.
Yeah, because you do get a sense, to use a fictional term, of a cast of people, and a cast of women that are around her and their lives and how they're impacted by the lifestyle that they're born into. So there's quite a lot actually going on there in terms of a group of people, I felt, and it was quite nice. I felt the way you could evolve in and out of those, you could leave a little bit of that for a while and come back to the relationship and then check in on the family, and it all felt very natural, which I really enjoyed. Speaking of all those people, have you shown it to them? Do you show it to them? Is there going to be a moment where that happens, or what's happened on that?
Yeah, I've showed it to them, and it's always it's the big, for me, I'm sure it's the same for you, it's the biggest moment, isn't it? It's far more than showing it to an audience or anything. Like, I know there's never any surprises because it's a collaborative thing all the way along. But at the same time, no matter how many times you tell people what you're doing and what it's about, it's a very different thing than to when they actually see it. It's not a very different thing, but it's an emotional, and it's a big deal seeing your life up on the screen. So yeah, of course I've showed it to them, and thankfully everyone was happy, because the trickiest thing, I think, in this kind of documentary that's shot over time, and I mean, COVID added an extra year to this whole thing, which what wasn't planned, is that people's lives move on, and obviously that's kind of part of what you're showing in the documentary. But the longer the window, the trickier it becomes, because we're all a little bit different than we were last year, but we're also quite different to what we were necessarily, or in some situations 3 years ago. And in the case of relationships, if relationships break down, you feel about one way about it. You said earlier it takes 6 months to get over a 1-year relationship. All these things, the longer it takes for film to be made and get out there, the more conscious you are of all these things moving in the background, and especially where lives are a bit chaotic, which, a lot of their lives are quite chaotic. You always fear that something bad could happen before the film is finished, or, all of that. So I'm so glad it's finally out there. But I showed it to them, and I always make a point of showing it to someone with them. I like watching it with someone, but obviously in this case, because of restrictions, I wasn't able to, and I just had to send it off on Vimeo, and be on the phone before and be on the phone straight after, and hope that it all made sense, and it did. So all Sharmaine's family have seen it, except Amari, actually, I think, hasn't seen it yet. And then Savannah has seen it, and everyone was happy. And as you probably know from experience too, usually, you might be worried about one thing. And again, I don't mean in a way that I would never misrepresent anyone or do it or put something on screen that they didn't want. But, there are certain moments in films where you kind of go, I hope they'll be okay about this, and every time it ends up being something like, I hate my hair at 43 minutes. It's always that. It's the tiny, silly little thing that you'd never thought of. Or so Sharmaine, for example, loved it, but was really pissed off about one still on a wall that I got a cutaway of, and she thinks her smile looks horrible in it, and she hates that photo, which I had no idea. Obviously, I never would have used it if I'd known. But it's just a tiny little detail, but it's important to her. And we all look at photographs and zone in on ourselves and go, ugh, I look awful in that. Everyone else thinks you look fine. They didn't even notice. And, imagine that multiplied by, a big screen. So, yeah, but it was a very strange experience not to be there watching with them. And I can't wait actually to get back and actually watch it again with them, hopefully for the US premiere or something like that.
So the film is showing in Galway this weekend. and hopefully some people will have listened to this between when it's published and the very short window until your film's actually shown, although it'll be available all weekend, I presume, for ticket holders with the way festivals now work. And well, listen, thanks a million for talking to me. I really liked the film. I thought it was really beautiful, and just want to wish you all the best of luck with it and this weekend and beyond.
Thanks, Ross.
Thanks again to Kim for taking part in the podcast. Pure Grit plays in the Galway Film Fleadh on July 23rd. It's both in person and online this year. I'm sure the film will find its way to festivals all over the world, and follow Kim Bartley Docs on Twitter to keep an eye on its progress. Thanks to Stephen Galvin and Film Ireland for supporting the podcast, and to film composer Michael Fleming for kindly allowing me to steal his music. You can find more of it at michaelflemingmusic.com. And thanks to you for listening.